On an autumn night in 1983, the village of Keyworth in Nottinghamshire lost its innocence. 16-year-old Colette Aram set out to walk to her boyfriend's house, along the same streets she had walked countless times before. Within an hour, she had vanished, and by the next day, her body was discovered in a nearby field. The crime was brutal, shocking, and seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the quiet, close-knit community it tore apart. For decades, the case remained unsolved, remembered only through grief, unanswered questions, and the haunting detail that it was the very first story ever featured on the BBC's Crime Watch. It would take 26 years and a revolution in DNA technology before investigators finally uncovered the hidden truth and revealed the ordinary family man who had lived among them all along. For the evidence room, this is the story of the murder of Colette Aram and how the miracle of DNA science changed not just this case, but forensics across Great Britain and beyond. Keyworth, Nottinghamshire, in the early 1980s at least, was the kind of place where parents let their children roam free without worry. A quiet village in the English Midlands, it was known for its picture postcard streets and neighborly calm. Crime was almost unheard of, and people spoke of it as one of the safest places a child could ever grow up. That's the world 16-year-old Colette Aram belonged to. A girl described by everyone who knew her as kind, gentle, considerate, and responsible. She was the sort of daughter who kept her parents informed of her plans, never giving them reason to worry. Colette dreamed of becoming a hairdresser, already working in a salon while making plans with her best friend, Karen Willis, to study together at college. She was innocent, family-oriented, and loyal to her friends. Karen Willis would later remember the strangeness of that night. As she walked to meet her own boyfriend, a car repeatedly honked its horn at her, leaving her unsettled. Only later would she connect that unnerving moment to the very same car tied to Colette's disappearance. And behind this crime was a man no one in Keyworth would have suspected. Paul Hutchinson was a 24-year-old man at the time, married, a young father, and gainfully employed as an electrician. He told people he had studied psychology. He blended in so well, he would later be trusted with roles like serving as a school governor. Outwardly, he was the picture of respectability, a family man with a steady job. But in private, Hutchinson harbored a very different nature. He was a sexual deviant with fixations that escalated in secret. He would spy on young girls while they rode horses, hiding in stables and sheds to gratify himself. His preference for underage girls and his paraphilic compulsions grew unchecked, and with no criminal record to raise alarms, he remained invisible to law enforcement. Years later, experts would describe him as a, quote, split-life offender, someone who appeared perfectly ordinary on the surface, but in reality lived with compulsions that were predatory, disturbing, and dangerous. On the evening of October 30th, 1983, 16-year-old Colette Aram left her home in Keyworth to walk to her boyfriend's house. It was just after 7 o'clock when she set off along Nicker Hill, a familiar route in what had always been considered a safe village. Across town, her best friend Karen Willis was having her own aforementioned encounter, the car pulling up beside her, its driver beeping twice in a way that felt off. Within the hour, other residents reported hearing a woman scream, followed by the screech of a car pulling away. Colette Aram never arrived at her boyfriend's house. Instead, she had been abducted by Paul Hutchinson. He raped and strangled her before dumping her body in a nearby field, deliberately posed in a degrading and sexualized way. It was Colette's own brother who tragically discovered her body the next day, a trauma that would undoubtedly never leave the family. The shockwaves through Keyworth were immediate. A village once known for its safety and openness became gripped with fear and suspicion. Parents stopped letting children walk alone. Neighbors looked at each other a little differently. And Karen Willis, she struggled with a terrible survivor's guilt, convinced it could have just as easily been her. Police knew instantly this was no runaway. Colette's reputation, her character, and her reliability told them something was terribly wrong. Searches began from her walking route outward, with the family and community mobilized alongside officers. Karen's description of the suspicious car was noted, but unfortunately led to nowhere. Meanwhile, Paul Hutchinson, cool and calculating as ever, was already trying to blend back into normal life. Just 20 minutes after the murder, he walked into the Generous Britain pub and ordered an orange juice and lemonade. He seemed strange to the staff, going to the bathroom to wash his hands and discarding a paper towel into the bin. Luckily, that towel, quietly retrieved by an alert detective, contained both blood and semen, a key piece of evidence, though in 1983, DNA testing didn't exist. As such, the sample would sit in storage for decades. Hutchinson couldn't resist feeding his own ego, though. He left Keyworth briefly, but soon returned, watching police activity and reliving what he'd done. He even taunted detectives with a letter, boasting that they couldn't catch him. That letter, it carried his fingerprint, but without a suspect to match, it again led to nowhere. His arrogance only deepened. When police revisited the case on Crime Watch, Hutchinson faked having cancer just to avoid suspicion, going so far as to pull out his own hair one by one. For the people of Keyworth, Colette's murder marked the end of innocence. A village defined by freedom and trust became one of restrictions and fear. For Colette's family, the grief and trauma were unending, and for investigators, the case grew cold. The evidence, the paper towel, Colette's clothing, and the taunting letter, they were preserved, but forensic science, again, wasn't yet advanced enough to use it. Hutchinson carried on with his double life, marrying again, raising children, and maintaining his image as a respectable member of the community. Lucky for law enforcement, that was all about to change. By the mid-2000s, forensic science had advanced in ways investigators working in 1983 could have never imagined. The samples preserved in Colette's case, her clothing, the paper towel discarded at the Generous Britain pub, and the taunting letter Hutchinson had sent police, were finally tested, and for the first time, full DNA profiles were created. But for years, those same profiles sat unmatched in the database. The killer's genetic fingerprint existed, but it belonged to no one yet on record. Then, in 2008, a massive break came in the most ordinary of ways. A 19-year-old man from Nottingham was arrested for careless driving. Like every arrestable offense, the process included a mugshot, fingerprints, and a cheek swab for DNA. When his profile was uploaded to the national database, it flagged a, quote, near miss with the DNA from Colette's case. The young man was far too young to have been involved. In fact, he had been born 5 years after her murder. But the match was close enough to suggest something else. The killer was almost certainly a male relative of this man. This was the beginning of a technique that transform cold cases: familial DNA. By examining the Y chromosome, which passes down almost unchanged from father to son, police could begin narrowing the suspect pool to a specific family line. Hundreds of possible matches were tested, and the first wave of results came back negative. But as the database grew, the search was repeated, and in 2009, after more than 600 near matches had been ruled out, the answer emerged. The partial hit from the 19-year-old driver pointed straight to his father. In April 2009, police arrested him and his two uncles. Their DNA swabs were rushed by helicopter to the forensic lab before the custody clock ran out. Within 9 hours, the results came back. One positive match. The killer of Colette Aram was then identified as Paul Hutchinson, then 51 years old, working quietly as a newspaper delivery agent. He tried to deflect suspicion at first, even going so far as to blame his deceased brother, but that too was disproven with DNA. The fingerprint from his taunting letter, that matched as well. In December 2009, Hutchinson finally pleaded guilty. In the following month, he was sentenced to life in prison. The breakthrough was not only a triumph for Colette's family, but also a turning point in British forensic science. The samples had first been tested by the Forensic Science Service, but the final breakthrough came from LGC Forensics, a private company that had grown into one of the UK's leading providers after the government's own lab system was weirdly dismantled. In fact, those techniques had already solved some of the country's most notorious cases. When Colette's killer was finally unmasked, it was proof of how far forensic science had come. This was part of a broader revolution in British policing, where the same advances that cracked Hutchinson's quote perfect crime were also reshaping other notorious cases. Take the murder of 10-year-old Damilola Taylor in 2000. His killing shocked London and drew national attention, but the first trial in 2002 collapsed under unreliable testimony and a lack of physical evidence. For years, the case seemed doomed to remain unsolved. But when forensic scientist Angela Gallup and her team revisited the evidence with more sensitive DNA technology, the breakthrough came. Blood from Damilola was identified on the trainers of Danny Preddy and on the cuff of his brother Ricky's sweatshirt, traces so minute they had been invisible to earlier testing. That same discovery led to their arrest, retrial, and eventual conviction for manslaughter in 2006. Without those DNA advancements, the truth of what happened on Blake's Road may have never been established. Rachel Nichols' case, too, is remembered as one of the most infamous miscarriages of justice in modern Britain. In 1992, Rachel was murdered in front of her 2-year-old son on Wimbledon Common. Police wrongfully pursued a man called Colin Stagg through a controversial entrapment operation, a tactic that collapsed in court and left the real killer free. For more than a decade, that case haunted detectives until new DNA methods were applied in the early 2000s. A tiny degraded sample on Rachel's clothing, one considered unusable earlier, was finally developed into a profile. This profile excluded Stagg completely and instead pointed toward Robert Napper, a man already imprisoned for other brutal killings. Napper ultimately pleaded guilty to manslaughter by diminished responsibility, and Colin Stagg was publicly exonerated. Together, these cases underscored a vital truth. Evidence that once seemed silent could still speak decades later. Cold cases that appeared unsolvable in the 1980s and 1990s were being reopened, re-examined, and resolved because forensic science refused to stand still. For Colette Aram's family, that persistence meant answers after 26 years. For others, like the Taylors and Rachel Nichols' loved ones, it meant closure that had once seemed impossible. And for the wider public, it was a reminder that even the longest shadows can eventually be lifted, not by luck, but by the relentless march of science. In Colette's case, their use of familial DNA made history. By then, DNA testing had shrunk from a process that once took months to something that could deliver results in days, even hours if needed. It was no longer a tool reserved for pristine samples, but could extract profiles from tiny degraded traces left on years-old evidence. For the people of Keyworth, new DNA technology meant a name, a face, and a conviction. For the Aram family, it meant justice, 26 years delayed, but not denied. And for the world of criminal investigation, it marked a watershed moment, reminding the world that even decades-old evidence could still solve the darkest of crimes. Paul Hutchinson thought he had outsmarted everyone. For more than 2 decades, he lived undetected, cloaked in the appearance of a respectable family man, while hiding the truth of what he had done to a 16-year-old girl walking through her village on an ordinary October night. But it was the arrogance of his own actions, the blood in the semen left behind on a paper towel, the fingerprint stamped on a taunting letter, that would one day unravel the double life he had so carefully constructed. When forensic science finally caught up to him in 2009, it was his own son's minor driving offense that triggered the familial DNA match that ended his years of secrecy. Hutchinson's conviction came 26 years after Colette's murder, but his sentencing offered only a fleeting sense of justice. Within months, he took his own life in prison, robbing Colette's family of the long-term accountability they had waited decades to see. The bitterness of that ending has never faded. For experts, Hutchinson's case became a textbook example of the so-called split-life offender, the neighbor who appears ordinary, even upstanding, while harboring hidden compulsions and violent fantasies. The case left a legacy larger than Hutchinson himself. Colette's murder was the very first ever featured on Crime Watch in 1984, ensuring that her name would be kept alive in the public eye, and that her story was never forgotten. And when her killer was finally unmasked, it demonstrated why evidence is preserved, why patience matters, and why science remains the great equalizer in even the coldest of cases. Colette Aram's story also fits into a broader legacy, shaped by advances in DNA technology. The murder of Damilola Taylor, once stalled by unreliable witnesses and failed trials, was finally solved when microscopic traces of blood tied the Preddy brothers to the crime. Rachel Nichols' case, disastrously mishandled through entrapment and the wrongful prosecution of Colin Stagg, was eventually redeemed when DNA pointed, instead, to Robert Napper. Together, these cases show the dual edge of criminal investigation, the devastating consequences when evidence is mishandled or technology falls short, and the undeniable power of modern forensics to correct those wrongs. For Colette's family, for Damilola Taylor's family, and for those wrongly accused like Colin Stagg, DNA became not just science, but the one tool capable of delivering the truth, a truth long overdue.